Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes. After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Ghost podcast and the 19th episode of our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film and TV history. I'm your podcast host, Anna Pogacka, and this one I've been looking forward to all series. It's a double banger featuring two of the most acclaimed films of the 2000s with two extraordinary ambiguous endings and two films that solidified their directors as the defining voices of genre filmmaking and, well, filmmaking in general. Joining me is chief film critic of The Independent, Clarisse Loughrey, one of my favorite minds, to talk about Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder and David Fincher's Zodiac. Both films take their inspiration from real-life cases, the former from a series of murders in Hwaseong in South Korea in the late 80s, and the latter from the still unsolved case of the Zodiac Killer, a murderer who terrified Northern California in the 60s. These are two of the most stunning and talked about examples of the serial killer genre, and yet neither of them actually feature the killer that much. And both of these films are extraordinary in their own right. Try to see them on the big screen if you can, but try to see them in any way. Be warned, our conversation is full of spoilers, with a dash of Scooby-Doo. That'll make sense later. If you want to show your appreciation for this episode or for this podcast in general, you can leave a rating or a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify Podcast. I read them all. I appreciate them all. Thank you so much for everyone who's rated the podcast so far. And you can also go to Patreon and support the podcast over there. You can also find me online and potentially yell at me about my choice of serial killer movies over at Anna B. Demented. And with all of that said, please enjoy our take on Memories of Murder and Zodiac.
But I read about the Zodiac Killer because
I know. Interests, hobbies.
Yeah, that's why I was like, Robert Graysmith. I would become him very easily. So,
well, hopefully he's not listening. And hopefully Fincher's not listening. Fincher's not allowed to listen. No. Bong Joon-ho is, though.
He can listen to anything that I do because he's great. And
yeah. He wouldn't correct us. I think Fincher would correct us.
Yeah. I feel like Bong Joon-ho would correct us, but in a way where I wouldn't cry myself to sleep that night. And I feel like David Fincher, God love him, fantastic director. It seems chill, but also I think has the ability to devastate people if he wants to.
Yes. I think that if David Fincher, one of my favorite living filmmakers, if he ever corrected anything I did, I would never do said thing ever again. And in fact, would probably retire myself to a cave somewhere and not speak to anyone else and just forever replay the moment of David Fincher correcting me.
Yeah, that's my greatest fear in many ways. It's not so, they say don't meet your heroes because there's this idea that, your hero will be disappointing. It's like, I'm not worried about that. I'm worried that I will disappoint them. And then I will not be able to live with that.
I'm worried that I would disappoint David Fincher specifically.
Yeah. I have met Bong Joon-ho and we got along great. And I'm like, I'm cool to not repeat that because the one time it was good. And I don't want to have the potential to disappoint him. It can happen again.
Exactly.
So I'm just going to treasure that experience.
So, Clarisse, it's been a minute since we've recorded together.
Yes.
the band is back together. I love it. To talk about
I know.
Memories of Murder and Zodiac. A movie that you have a lot of feelings about, and another one that I cannot stop watching despite my better judgment.
Yeah, and can we pretend that you like rang me up in a phone booth at 2 a.m?
I might have. You have no way of knowing that I didn't.
Yeah, and you're like, the Zodiac. And I said yes.
I just ran you up
I'll be
with a
there.
lot of heavy breathing, and you immediately knew what I was asking you.
Oh yeah, I'll be there. Don't worry.
Okay. So I don't know how to segue from the heavy breathing, but let's start with what I've been asking everyone in this series about serial killers. What do you think of when you think of a movie serial killer?
Are these like the attributes of the serial killer? Like the heavy breathing is definitely one.
You can interpret that question as openly as you wish to.
Well, I think my just feeling about serial killers on film, and I think this is something that's very pertinent to the two movies we're talking about today, is, are we interested in this because we desire justice? Or are we interested in this because, as Robert Graysmith says multiple times in Zodiac, I like puzzles?
Both. Maybe both.
That's the thing. I think it is a combination of both, but I think the interrogation of ourselves every time that we engage with this topic, I think it's both interesting and important because... You know, I think so much about these two movies and the culture of serial killer movies in general links directly to the true crime obsession that we're having at the moment. And I think, I don't know, I have kind of a complicated relationship with it in which I do really understand the appeal, and I do find myself kind of researching these things because I want to understand why something like this could happen, and knowing that the Zodiac killer was a person like me and I'm a person, but what is the difference between us? You know, that this person was led to commit these horrific acts, and I hopefully am not ever in my lifetime. I think I don't think there's anything wrong with asking ourselves that question. I think it's a natural curiosity, and it's a scary unknown thing that we want to solve. But then you get to the tipping point where it's like, well, but then, you know, it becomes an obsession. It becomes a fetishization of, you know, real people losing their lives in horrific ways. It becomes, you know, if you turn it into too much of a puzzle, you lose the humanity of these people who died. So it's, yeah, I think I get a lot of feelings with when it comes up, because I don't know if I have a fixed position on it. And yeah, and in terms of like typical serial killer, yeah, I would say heavy breathing. Heavy breathing phone calls, like, especially on film, because this isn't so common in real life, but I think because especially the Zodiac killer became such a huge like cultural thing, it's always, yeah, ciphers, weird calling cards,
self-branding, self-aggrandizing,
yeah, like maybe like in a little outfit or something.
A uniform.
Yeah,
a logo.
There is always a branding aspect, because I think cinema's obsessed with the mythological side of the serial killer. They kind of want the serial killer to not be a person. Yeah. Even though the unfortunate truth is that they are very much a person.
Well, you bring up several kind of really interesting threads, and one of them is the self-mythologizing of the serial killer, kind of, as you mentioned, separating them from the very banal reality of just being another person who is doing terrible things. And I think the self-mythologizing is in many ways, as I've been watching these movies in a loose chronological order, they often participate in the creating of the mythology, of the building up of the fantasy, of the building up of the murders, building up of this person to the point where they're no longer a person. And that sort of makes the enjoyment of these films easier perhaps than true crime, because true crime is all consumed by the puzzle, right? It's the puzzle,
Yes.
and it's also the moral separation between the people committing the crimes and the people investigating the crimes, so the people who were victims of the crimes, right? It's like there's evil and there's not evil. It's very black and white. And when the movies are doing their movie stuff, they're mythologizing and aestheticizing, that might not be a word. They're making into an aesthetic the act and the fantasies of the killers. And that then becomes difficult, because then it's also part of the machinery of movies where it's reviewed, it's released, it's acclaimed. Those actors become movie stars. Those directors become auteurs and hyper lauded by different awards bodies and so on and so forth. So they're just stories.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So do you think then, which is more, and this is not to condemn anyone, this is not to condemn anybody, but which do you think is more morally problematic? The true crime, I guess, podcast thing of unsolved murder cases in which we focus on the victims, but potentially like kind of fetishizing them or turning them into characters in a story, or I guess more what these movies are, which is, I don't know, like kind of like, yeah, portraits of known killers, where the bigger question is, I guess, is the psychology question of why did they do it? Do you think one is, I don't know. Do you see a difference between them?
I do see a difference between them, and I'm hoping to have an episode in the future of this series before it wraps up where it is kind of all about that question, because I'm trying to figure it out for myself. And many much smarter people have been writing and thinking about this question for a very long time. I personally do not like to morally condemn any form of art, or any form of movie making or storytelling. It will take a lot for me to think that a film is genuinely harmful to people, to audiences. And a very few times in my life have I thought that. The thing that I really turn my nose up at is not actually one or the other. It's when someone, usually it's the people making the thing, be that a true crime documentary or a true crime book or a movie. Movie is slightly separate from this. I think it's mostly with the nonfiction element. For me, it's mostly the people who have higher pretenses than what the thing that they're making actually is. So when someone is talking about, how they want to solve this mystery for the sake of the victims, and that all they care about is the victims and the victim's family and the closure, but then when they're actually producing is very self-serving and very much does not give a shit about the victims and is mainly just interested in, let's say, a good content or a good story, it's the moral dissonance for me that is the thing. There's you can just go for the story and go to, find the characters that will make it very watchable and very engaging, and then you can actually do the heavy journalistic lifting of actually bringing it all together without dehumanizing the victims of the crimes that you're investigating. For me, it's always the people who say they want to do B but are actually doing A, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I agree, because I think you can do it with both sides. I guess it's part of it is, I think, understanding. If you get a sense that the person has asked themselves a question of like, is this for justice or for love of puzzles?
Yes, exactly. And that will come up in Zodiac very clearly. But talking about both of these films, and there's many reasons why I wanted to group them together. What is your relationship with both of these films, with Bong Joon-ho's Memories of Murder and David Fincher's Zodiac?
I don't think I saw either when they came out, because when Zodiac was like
2007.
2007. Yeah, I didn't see it in the cinema, but I've seen both multiple times. Memories of Murder I saw on the first time in a cinema on a date.
Ooh.
It wasn't a first date. Don't worry, guys.
I mean, I would go on a first date to see Memories of Murder.
I probably would, actually, because you know that person has taste.
Yeah.
And I just, I'm sorry, I was like, think of a special anecdote. I don't have a special anecdote for either. I just think both are incredible.
Which one did you see first?
I would have seen Zodiac first, definitely.
Me too. I remember, I think I did see Zodiac in 2007 when it came out. I think I was living in London at the time for the first time, and I probably went to see it at the PCC at one of their £1 screenings because it was what I could afford. And I have to say, I only saw Memories of Murder last year, also the PCC, and I was completely blown away by it. But Zodiac is one of my Christmas movies. It's one of my comfort movies that I will watch if I'm ever sort of in a funky headspace and I just want to be cradled by cinema. I'll put on either Silence of the Lambs or Zodiac.
I get that. I have that with Stoker.
Yes.
And it's such a horrible little movie, but I love it.
And I kind of love these films, I mean, for multiple reasons that I'm sure we'll discuss, but one of the things that I find very curious about them in the context of kind of this series that I've been doing is that both of them are focused on the detective work around the serial killer, on the capture of the serial killer, as opposed to the serial killer himself. Do you think that the detective figure is as crucial to the serial killer movie as the killer himself?
Oh, that's a good question. I think for the most part, yes, but that's also where you run into so many of the problems. Because I think what's so smart about you pairing these two movies together is that they are very, they also want to analyze the figure of the detective.
Yes.
And who are they and what is their role and what do we do in heroizing them? And I think it's interesting. I was watching them back to back, because that's a thing I'd never done, is watch them in such close succession, is they're sort of doing the same thing and yet it's completely different at the same time. So I don't know, it's tricky, because I think there have been fantastic movies about serial killers that don't involve I'm thinking of My Friend Dharma. I think was a brilliant way to approach that person, because it was really trying to ask the question of, is this a behavior and a pattern that we can recognize, and is there a way to stop this? And I don't think there was any detective, because it sort of ended before when the first murder happened.
Yeah.
But then I think so much of what we know about certain serial killers is through the investigation, so I feel like it's quite rare to have a movie like that.
One of the kind of, not issues, but one of the challenges that I had in putting together this list is to stay away from too many detective heavy films, because a lot of the films that involve the serial murderer, serial killer, involve the chase. Like, there's such a huge intersection, not just with true crime as the non-fiction side, but on the fictional side, it's the detective mysteries. It's, it's Sherlock Holmes and all his descendants. It's all the police focused or the private detective focused, like film noir films as well. They might be chasing after a killer that's more greedy rather than murderers, but that figure, I think, kind of goes hand in hand. And I think you're completely right. And I also watched these films back to back, which I'd never done before, and they are essentially following a very, very similar structure and have the same ending. but evoke completely different feelings. And obviously because they're done by two very different types of filmmakers, they're stylistically doing very different choices. But I think that one of the things that a detective is required to do in a serial killer movie for me is to become utterly obsessed with a killer, to the point where they sort of have to be pulled back or reminded that this killer and this pursuit is not the only thing that exists, is not the defining thing of them. And sometimes in the case of Robert Graysmith in Zodiac, it kind of does become their defining life obsession, is the thing that makes them into who they are, reveal something about them that they didn't know before. So they're so interrelated. You know, this is Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty in a way, right? You know, can you have the light without the dark? And these films are kind of that, but from only one perspective. We never get to meet the killer. We never get to know who they are. They never get to look them in the eyes and know for certain that they are the person they were looking for.
Yes, it's because the like atypical detective, I guess in a fictional space, detective versus serial killer, it does adopt the Sherlock Moriarty idea, because the serial killer, I don't know, maybe I'm overstepping. I feel like the serial killer most of the time is aware of the detective and is sort of taunting the detective, and it becomes this very personal, like, you know, it's a dance.
Yeah, it's like a mouse
it's
game,
a relationship. While what's different about these two, and I guess partially because they draw from real cases, is that yes, the Zodiac killer taunts the detectives and several figures in that story, but you never get the sense that they're like equals or rivals, or there's some sort of like, oh, maybe it's like a romance kind of energy to it. And you get the sense that the Zodiac killer's just like, oh, you pigs. Right? He's just like annoyed. He's just annoyed at the existence of these people, and he just wants them to like, just print my letters and make me famous. I don't care about you individually as a person. Would you agree with that?
I would. And I think it's the same in Memories of Murder too, you know, because that killer never even interacts with the police. And maybe isn't even aware of what they're doing, or how close they're getting, or how not close they're getting. Because, you know, we never get to see him. We never get to hear from him. The film completely spends all of its time with the three policemen and a lot of different suspects who are ultimately absolved. Like, they're not the killer. And going back to what you were saying, and to dig a little bit more into Memoirs of Murder, both these films are very interested in how pursuing and not finding a serial killer actually changes the pursuers, because the killer he's just getting on with his business.
Yes. And to me, the crucial difference is, well, maybe this is interpretation, but I feel like, especially Park Do-man, the lead detective in Memories of Murder, I feel like the obsession is very different to Robert Graysmith in Zodiac, in terms of it doesn't feel like he's interested in the puzzle, or like actually solving the murder to solve the murder. It seems like he's just like, don't you dare tell me I'm bad at my job.
Yes!
Anonymous murderer.
Absolutely.
How dare you? Right? It doesn't seem like there's no glory in it. And I think that it's a really interesting thing, because they talk about the FBI in Memories of Murder, and they say that, the FBI, they're always figuring things out. Because they have so much land in America. They got so much space to explore, while we don't have it, so we just do it with our feet. And they're kind of trying to make excuses for why they're not good at...
Yes.
They're not great detectives in this. I mean, I would say the detective from Soul is like a little better. But he's the main guy, not good. Yeah.
What do you think? I love the relation. I love all the three detectives, and so that's Park Do-man, the main guy, the local guy. There's Cho Young-koo, who's the dude who kicks. It's his partner who's always roundhouse kicking everyone. I mean,
I shouldn't laugh.
we shouldn't laugh because it's
also
police
really
corruption,
funny.
but also he just all of a sudden he just walks in a room and he's like roundhouse kicks a suspect right in the chest, and you're like, first of all, how do you get the like the potency to just, while you're just standing straight, you're not running into somewhere, you don't have the you're not propulsing yourself, it's just like all of a sudden boom, roundhouse kicking someone straight in the chest. Anyway, and then there's
The airtime is insane. That actor, it was like, how are you doing that with your body? I don't know.
And then there's Seo Tae-yoon, the detective who volunteers from Seoul, who comes to this small town to help solve the murders, because I guess similarly to Park, he wants to, maybe there's a little bit of like big city, small town rivalry going on. He wants to prove that he can solve this murder that nobody else can, that he's that great a detective that he can do it. And he also gets humbled because they can't. What do you think?
And I would say he feels more like the characters, like an American detective. Because I think it's about, this is the thing I have to say, I don't know if I can talk about with any knowledge, are the differences between Memories of Murder and Zodiac a sort of a cultural thing of how how South Korea approaches detective fiction, of how it or even just this genre, or is this a specific Bong Joon-ho thing? Because if you look at the rest of his filmography, it sort of makes sense that he would portray detectives as complete buffoons. So that's the thing. I don't know if I can speak to the reasons for that difference.
I can't either. I can only speak of it just on the surface of how it uses storytelling, how it sits in the serial killer genre space, how it sits in comparison to Zodiac, which is a film so structurally and thematically similar to it, and similar in time as well of release. But before we get into that, what do you think about the relationship between the three lead detectives and how the investigation, the unsolved investigation into the serial murders going on in their town, affect them and affect the relationship between them?
It's just very chaotic.
Straight up.
This movie's so chaotic, and I feel like what you're talking about, this idea of how it affects them, it's done in so much less of a conventional manner than, sorry, I will keep talking about Zodiac because I just feel I'm just thinking about them so in comparison.
They're
now.
intertwined, yeah, totally.
It's so different because you don't have as much the scenes of like the wife at home going, what about your kids? You don't really have as much of that. Their entire lives are just this case, and they go out to karaoke and they get drunk and they're still talking about the case. And so I don't know, maybe my feeling of it is that you just get the sense that they just don't have a life outside of it, and they just become the case, and every step that they feel humiliated by every single false lead or a suspect that doesn't work out, that then this God, just this feeling of desperation creeps in. It feels almost by the end like they don't. Well, I would say Seo is a bit, the detective from Seoul is a bit different because he has this relationship with the last victim. So I think he is emotionally affected by that in a way that it reminds him that this is about human victims and there are women and girls being killed in horrible ways. That explains, I guess, the final scene, because it feels like Park is just become obsessed not about the crimes anymore, but just like that feeling. I feel like it's a very relatable thing of like, you know when you're arguing with somebody on Twitter and you're like, I need to prove you wrong because how dare you, like, how dare you get one over? I feel like that is, by the end of the movie, his primary motivation in life is, I have to prove this guy wrong. And I feel like that's sort of where we are at the end of the movie.
Well, I completely agree with you, and that's partly where I stay away from Twitter as well. But there's something as well about them being essentially broken down as people as well as detectives by the end of the film, because, Park is very heavy on the intuition. He's got a kind of more, I'm not going to say supernatural, but supernatural friendly approach to investigating. He feels like he can see in the eyes of someone whether they're guilty or not. He goes to a medium. He tries this ritual to try to discover the killer. Then Seo is very much following the rule book. He's all about the science, the evidence, the process. And Cho is all about the physical violence, right? He thinks that he can beat the truth out of anyone. And by the end of the film, each one of them has had their main power, let's call it that, taken away from them, because Park cannot tell anymore who's guilty or not. He looks straight in the final scene where they're in the tunnel, in the train tunnel. He looks straight in the eyes of this guy and he cannot tell. He doesn't know anymore. His eyesight, is sort of clouded. He can't tell the innocent from the guilty. The Cho has his leg amputated. He literally cannot roundhouse kick anyone anymore. And Seo gets this DNA result from the FBI and refuses to believe it. So he kind of turns his back on the pragmatic evidence that has been his guiding light the entire time, because it's also disappointed him. So each one of them sort of completely loses their way as detectives by the end of the film. They're kind of undone by their inability to solve this series of murders, either separately or together.
Yeah, and I really liked the casting of the third Park Hyun-gyu, like the last guy, because he's got that Paul Dano as the Riddler smile,
yes.
Where and I think there's an interesting thing when they cast either serial killers or the convincing suspect of what sort of performance do you ask out of people. And there is something, it's something about the smile, there has to be a bit of smugness about it to suggest to the audience that this person is keeping a secret, but then they also have to be a little bit unfocused with the eyes. And I hate to say that I was thinking of the Riddler. I hate to say it.
I mean, that's okay. I think the Riddler and that Batman, which I will cover in the series, actually.
It's a pretty good one.
It's pretty good, and it drinks a lot from Fincher's serial killer movies and TV show.
Yeah. And Paul Dano just plays a serial killer really well. I'm so sorry.
He does. He's really good at it.
He's the sweetest man in real life.
But it's like Jesse Plemons, the sweetest man who plays absolute sociopath so well.
Yeah.
And, you alluded to this before, but I would love to hear, where do you think this film sits in the work and the career of director Bong Joon-ho?
Why, I think the thing that really attaches it is because there's this background that one of the reasons they can't actually give the detectives any resources is that there are protests in the background, and riots against political corruption, and they're constantly saying oh yeah, we can't give you any guards to try and apprehend this guy because they're all too busy beating up protesters. And I feel that's the sort of thing that in a weird way colors the entire movie, because it's what is anyone's priority in this situation? The idea of actual justice and actual safekeeping of, you know, the women in this area just keeps getting knocked lower and lower and lower and lower. And I think, you know, for Bong Joon-ho having always been a, like, I guess a very political filmmaker, but who's always talking in metaphors, I would say, I guess Memories of a Murder is a weird, it's sort of a metaphor in itself, even though it is about very material things.
What do you think it's a metaphor for?
What we prioritize. And the idea that, you know, because we were talking about this obsession, the detective's obsession and their demoralization and them being knocked down, it's like, and you go, well, that's sad, but at the end of the day, it's sort of not about you, right? It's about the women being killed. And I feel like the way that these men continue, like, because they do, it is sort of a funny movie. It's incredibly dark, but it's
got real
at
moments
times,
of humor.
Yeah, kind of a comedy, because these are clown men, and they have such inflated ideas of themselves, and the part of the dehumanization is them also being consistently detached from the reality of what's happening. And I feel like it's sort of, that's the way that it parallels the, you know, the protests happening in the background. It's like the complete, just the constant dehumanization by, you know, men in power who are too focused on themselves. I guess I would say that's the metaphor.
I love that.
I'm working this out real time because I actually did not think about this before I started the sentence.
No, I love that, because that ties into also the way that it, you know, you mentioned this earlier, the way that Memories of Murder deconstructs the figure of the detective, and the fact that every single one of these detectives is corrupt in a larger sense. You know, they're not beacons of morality. They're biased, they're violent. They torture their suspects. You know, we see 3 suspects in the duration of the movie, and they abuse their power constantly. They constantly try to make them, essentially tell them what is that they want to hear so they can close the case. And it's not even projection. It's just full on trying to beat them into a false confession. And knowing that they operate like that, I think, I'd love to hear what you think. I think for me, it instantly troubles my ability as an audience to believe that the potential suspect might be the killer. Because I'm automatically seeing them as victims of, like, really flawed men who have a modicum of power.
Especially because the first guy is, you know, it's an intellectually disabled guy that they coach into confessing. You're immediately like, and then also I find it interesting that they're such misogynists.
Oh God, yes. Constantly.
They are like, they have the woman that they use as kind of bait, and they're in the car going, oh, she looks hot in that red top, and it's like, oh God, Jesus Christ, you're no better than this guy. And then they have the woman who comes with the radio broadcast, and she makes this incredible breakthrough that is actually quite key to solving, well, then don't solve the case, but it's quite a key clue that they're always playing this one song on the radio when the murders happen, and they just completely dismiss her.
Yeah, they
so
literally laugh in her face.
And yeah, and it I think that in a weird way you go, well, gosh, the actual separation between these men and the murderer is getting narrower and narrower as the movie goes on, which is I think troubling, and also quite pertinent to conversations about, because I think it is interesting when we talk about, you know, cinematic depictions of detectives. I think culturally we like to separate them from the police.
Yes,
when they're sort of not separate, because I think, you know, we have this dialogue about, you know, was it like Brooklyn Nine-Nine sort of had to end because we're like, culturally we cannot be glorifying these people anymore. And yet, you know, more pure detective shows, because I guess that they were detectives, but it was very much in a police oh my gosh, office, what do they call it?
A station?
Police
Department?
Station. Yeah, it takes place in a police station, so it's like a precinct. It's very visibly they are the police, even though they're doing detective work. But I think culturally, and I'm putting myself in this because I definitely like detective things. Culturally, we're very good at separating them, and we watch our detective shows, and because they hide their badges and they wear nice coats, leather coats and jackets, we don't think of them as wielding like governmental power, right?
As being part of a system that is much larger than any one individual. Well, that's why I think like figures like Sherlock Holmes are so influential for the serial killer detective in particular, because someone like Holmes, he is separate from the police, you know. He's not a PI, he's, you know, whatever, the world's smartest detective, blah blah blah, although I think that's Batman. But anyway, Batman is also a great figure in this regard, because, you know, they're adjacent to the system, but they're not part of it.
Which is why I never liked Batman. Because ACAB applies to him. And this is maybe a different episode, but I do think you are bang on the money of something. There is a cultural confusion there of what exactly is the detective and who do they work for? Are they the independent genius who is just solving these murders because their big brain can do it? And
because they like the puzzle, like you said.
They like the puzzle, which is, you know, I think we feel more forgivable. Or are they acting as a representative of the law in capitalized letters?
And, you know, in that sense, in Memories of Murder, there are two different sets of victims, which is what makes this film so unbelievably great. There's many reasons why it's absolutely phenomenal, but the way it complicates both the serial killer movie as its own kind of type of storytelling structure and type of film, that our expectations, the expectations for it that it contains, completely upends that. And it also really complicates the figure of the detective, because in the film there's essentially two sets of victims. There's the victims of the serial killer and there's the victims of the police, who are like aggressively victimized throughout the entire film. And like I was talking about before, that makes it really difficult for us, or at least for me, to see them as real suspects, because I'm seeing that they're being beaten and tortured into saying whatever it is that they need to say to get out of that situation.
And the first guy, they just kind of imprison him.
Totally.
There's a scene where he falls out of the cupboard and you're like, shouldn't this guy be at home? Right?
Just let him sleep in the cupboard. That's all he wants to do. It's very harmless.
And I would say this is, when I said like the chaotic side of it, it's because I think sort of before rewatching it, my overriding memory of the movie is always that long take, and it's all in one frame of when they're drinking after the karaoke. And they're talking about the case, and then the guy vomits, and there's something happening in the background where they're like making out with a girl, and it's so, and the frame is like messy in a beautiful way. There's shit all over the table, and it's just, you get so many of those shots that I think we are so unused to seeing in this genre, because, you know, detective movies about control, slick, minimalist, beautiful lighting, and this is just like
well, it's also, there's another great example of what you're describing, which is when they're having dinner, and they're having dinner at the family restaurant of the family of the first suspect, and he again falls out of a cupboard because he was napping there. And again, it's very messy, it's very chaotic, there's so much stuff on the table, so much food, you know. Then he gets given a pair of sneakers from Park, and like there's all this shit happening. And it's also, you know, I almost hesitate using the big word of corruption, because it's just very small town. And I think that's another important part about this film. It's set in the late 80s, right? And which is where the actual murders that it's inspired by in the I will be completely butchering the name of the region, but the Hwasong region, that were happening in the late 80s and early 90s. And like this is not the big city. This is not San Francisco. This is not New York City. The sort of resources, the urbanite approach of the detectives is completely not there. These are small town detectives dealing with something they don't have the capacity or the experience to deal with.
And because they solved the...
They did.
Was it after the movie came out?
It was after the movie, dude. I was reading about this yesterday, and I didn't know about this myself. Apparently, the movie was so hugely successful in Korea and globally as well, obviously, that it inspired kind of the investigation to be resurrected. And it led to the identification of the killer, who was a guy who was already actually in prison for another crime. And eventually they tied him to it.
Wow.
Mad.
Bong Joon-ho solving murders.
I mean, truly, as if he could not be any better. And what do you think of the way that, because this is another staple of the serial killer movies, it's the murders. What do you think about the way that the murders are portrayed and a brief glimpse at the murderer himself?
Oh, that shot in the field.
Fuck me. I didn't even notice it the first time. I only noticed it on my second watch.
Because I think when I went on the date, I think he'd seen it before.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think he nudged me. Because I saw it the first time. It scared me to the bone. No. It's terrifying. And I guess I would say about the murder, because this is the tricky thing, right? Mm-hmm. Is we want to respect the real victims, but also you have to, as a filmmaker, to express the severity and the monstrousness of these crimes. And I think he struck a pretty good balance, I would say, because it is really profoundly upsetting, those scenes where they find the bodies, and also the little, those like little moments of the murders that we see. Mm-hmm. But it's brief. Sometimes I think it's almost just like the amount of time it's on screen. If you can give an impression but not linger on it, immediately you have such an emotional reaction to it, but you don't feel revelate, like, you don't feel traumatized by it or like stuck in it. Yeah, and it's interesting because I believe the pantyhose, the fact that they're strangled with their items of their own clothing, was based on the real murders. But the thing of the stuff being like put up the vagina was invented for the movie.
Oh, thanks for that.
I believe. I'm so sorry if I got it wrong, but I did think that was interesting because the killer in the film seems to have more of a Zodiac-esque, here's my calling card, and I think the thing on the song on the radio is also invented. Mm-hmm. It feels like they've added that element of the mythologization, but I feel like it's subtle. It's subtle enough that I am doubting myself saying that didn't actually happen. Yeah. But it's like not too extreme where it doesn't feel like, oh, we're trying to be like the Zodiac killer. Because I feel like the Zodiac killer in the history of like murders is just such an extreme example of how they act, that I think it's had such a cultural effect on how we portray serial killers, that we think all of them or like having these, they have to come up with a brand, right? Which is for the most part not the case. They just kill people.
And this is see the aftermath. We see the crime scene. The commitment to the point of view of the detectives, I think, extends to that as well. We get a couple of scenes from the point of view of the killer, which are chilling, but we sort of are spared the actual murdering. We see sometimes a capture, and then we cut immediately to the aftermath. We see kind of these dead women's bodies. And I think it's sort of the commitment to the point of view of the detectives that makes it not as icky as other films. There's so many of the same ilk that start with a dead woman's body and then just continue to pile them up. And there's the moment with the final victim where Seo kind of covers her up, pulls down her underwear over her, so as little of her skin is showing. But we there is this detachment from the victims that I guess kind of detectives need to have to a point, you know, similarly to doctors. Like you sort of have to turn off your human empathy, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to do your job. You wouldn't be able to deal with seeing what you need to see if you're just consumed by the grief and the terror of seeing a human life taken in these kind of brutal ways. So I think that's, for me, it falls in line with the rest of the point of view and the tone of the film, that the bodies feel very much like props as opposed to people, because except for that one girl, we never get to meet them as people in the world. We don't know anything about them. We just know them as bodies.
Yeah, I would say, I think I've certainly to me, it's bodies with a clear sense that evil has been done to them. I think, does that make sense? It's like, I get very strongly kind of the awful, I can get immediately that something just horrific has happened to this person. But it's more about the act versus the person that it happened to.
And what do you make of the final suspect? Because I think that's the only guy that we really get a sense of, oh, it might be him.
Well, that Paul Dano smile.
Yeah.
That's because I would say, well, it's not him because the evidence says so. But then that Paul Dano, this is why I can't be a detective, because I go, he looks like the Riddler, arrest him. But I guess you sort of mentioned this before. I think the tortuousness of the ending is the idea that in the sense of the law and in sense of a criminal case, he is absolved by the evidence because the DNA does not match. And so if you tried to arrest, it wouldn't hold up in court. But I think, as much as these detectives were sort of repulsed by, I think it's hard for us as an audience to not be drawn into their hysteria a little bit. So I feel like you are left with a little bit of but maybe but then
he's not.
It's tricky.
Well,
because the girl says at the end he looked ordinary, but I guess that's it's like, God, it could be anyone.
Well, I agree with you. I feel like we're really at this point in the film, because it's the last guy. We are and he is quite arrogant and antagonistic to the detectives. So just based on his attitude, we kind of wanted to be him. But then when he's absolved by the evidence and he's essentially being beaten up with his hands tied behind his back in the rain in this train, on the train tracks, that close-up shot of him and Park looking each other in the eyes is, I don't even know how to describe it. It's so unbelievably effective because it's so challenging. You don't know what you want it to be him, but then it's not, and you're questioning yourself as to why you want it to be him. You kind of just want it to be over at this point. I think you kind of want it to be solved, and I think we as an audience maybe refuse to accept that it will not be solved. And that's exactly what happens in the epilogue, because this really is the ending of the story but not the movie. The guy walks off into the darkness. Again, just a gorgeous shot that carries so much with it, right? Because he has been so brutalized and victimized by these detectives that, and we see a couple of those scenes where he's now the black sheep of the town. People think he's the murderer, even though he's not. Nobody cares about the DNA test. People are just like, oh, they thought that he was the killer, and who knows, maybe he was. So, better watch out. He's doomed socially. And kind of the last thing to talk about really is that ending when Park comes back to the town. He's quit being a detective. He's got another job. He's married his girlfriend who was giving him Is this what's like saline solution or water intravenously in the middle of the forest?
Yeah.
And he comes back and sees this and looks through the same tunnel, the scene of where the very first body was found, and meets this girl who saw the killer do the exact same thing. And the entire film ends on him looking directly into the audience for this extended close-up shot. What do you think of the ending? How did it make you feel?
He's the killer. No. I think to tie that last shot to this idea of the final suspect, the reality is that there's no answer until there's an answer. And it could have been that last guy, but it almost probably wasn't. But there's always that 0.1% chance that it is, and this is, kind of what drives these men insane, and also to do monstrous things themselves, right? I guess it's sort of a, I've become a monster by chasing the monster narrative. And to me, I guess the very final close-up is, it's desperately sad, and yet I think there is an element of acceptance to it, of going, I'm never going to catch this guy. Because this little girl has told me he looks like it could literally be any person. It could be me. I guess I do interpret that final shot as being I'm gonna be insane for the rest of my life moment of acceptance.
That's so interesting, because I see it as a real challenge to the audience. It's that I think it poses the same question that I was asking you at the very beginning. What do you think of when you think of a serial killer movie? I think that's sort of the question. It's like, what are you here for? Why are you watching this? What did you want to see? Did you want to see the killer? Well, how do you feel now that you don't get to see him? This desire to, and this kind of goes, this question exists in both Memories of Murder and Zodiac, of I just want to look him in the face. I want to look him in the eyes. It's like, why do you want to look him in the eyes? What are you going to see there? Are you going to see something that you already know? Or do you want it to be comforting that you are so very different from the person who is committing these murders? I think that's a really fucking challenging series of questions that is asked in this one shot, in this one performance. The whole performance, the whole film, but particularly that final shot of Song Kang-ho's face in close-up.
Yeah, I agree. That is really interesting. I do agree with that. I think it's something for him and it's something for us. Because I do see there's something's happened in his head where I think he's reached a moment of, I will forever be insane about this, and you too, audience.
Yeah.
I've done this to you now.
If I don't get any closure, you don't get any closure either.
Good night.
And roll credits.
Yeah, which then I think speaks to, this is why conspiracy theories exist, because the human mind, in a way, cannot accept uncertainty, and it desires an answer in whatever way it can reach it, even if it's completely illogical and completely insane. The human brain is going to try to make a connection. And I think there's something very distressing when you can't make the connection.
And moving on to talking about Zodiac a bit more in depth, there's another trio of detectives, although they're not all detectives, but they are all chasing the Zodiac killer. There's Paul Avery, the journalist, that's played by Robert Downey Jr. There's Dave Toschi, the actual detective, played by Mark Ruffalo. And, of course, Robert Graysmith, who's the author of the book the film is sort of based on, and the cartoonist, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. How are they portrayed? and how does the Zodiac investigation change them?
Well, Robert Graysmith's kind of his own thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, he sort of carries the second half of the movie.
Yeah, he just really likes puzzles, and I sort of really relate to him because it's just when he sorry, I'm immediately going very niche, and you asked me a generalized question, but it's when he meets Dave Toschi and he's immediately getting out of his briefcase library books. From going, well, I read all these books, and the code is from these 3 books. And I think it's going back to kind of what we've been talking about. That's so detached from the murders themselves. Why? He's like all in on the code. And it feels almost like the murder is a secondary thing. He just wants to figure out what the crypto. And I relate to that, and I appreciate it. And then I feel like the other 2, there's this big question of, which I think in Memories of Murder is not as relevant, this question of notoriety, because Paul Avery is a columnist and his name is very public. And I guess Robert Graysmith is writing a book about it. He's going to financially benefit from these murders, let's be real.
Yeah.
Dave Toschi is literally the guy they base Bullet on.
And Dirty Harry.
Mm-hmm. He has... There's this pursuit of the self that really comes into it that I think complicates these characters in a big way that even becomes more... Like, I think all the conversations we've just had about kind of branches of authority and are they cops, are they like what separates them? And I know obviously journalism in itself is sort of let's not get into that conversation, but
yeah, technically
a branch of authority.
Totally. It's another vertical power.
Establishment.
Mm-hmm.
It's all the establishment,
Mm-hmm.
And they all represent the establishment in some way. But I think even above that conversation is what they individually gain from it. And it makes them all very unreliable, even though I do have a preference for Robert Graysmith, and it's going to be hard to
Well, that's so interesting because my preference is actually for Dave Toschi, which might be controversial. Well, maybe, but no, not really, because I find this to be kind of the central question of, and what makes again Zodiac such an interesting parallel text to Memories of Murder, because even Paul Avery's character in the film asks Graysmith when they start to bond over Aqua Velvas, he's like, what's in it for you? He's getting the bylines. Dave Toschi, that's his job. He needs to solve it. He needs to close that case. Nothing's in it for Graysmith. At the start, eventually, history has shown he has benefited probably the most financially and in terms of notoriety from the Zodiac killings. He was writing that book, but that investigation that takes him like a decade, that is completely kind of driven by his own obsession, that's not his job. That's his hobby. So he has no business becoming obsessed with the Zodiac murders, and he has no real ability to investigate it. I mean, he then eventually has access to all these files and documents and people and stuff, but he really is just interfering. He's a background character who picks up the investigation when everybody else just trails off because so much time has passed. But Avery is in it for the bylines and the notoriety, and Toschi's in it not so much for, becoming a pop culture figure in and of himself, but to solve it. He's the only one who mentions the victims and the families. He's the only one, and he's talking about kind of other people, other crimes that he's working on. But Avery and Graysmith, not at any moment do they consider the actual victims. They're just puzzles. Avery is more obsessed with Zodiac, with the guy, and Graysmith is obsessed with figuring out who he is.
All 3 of them have slightly different psychological profiles. Oh, totally. I guess.
Yeah.
And I think I unfortunately fit the Robert Graysmith psychological part. You say he gets nothing out of it. The high of solving a puzzle.
My God.
It's like nothing else on this planet, to the point that I don't do puzzles. Everyone does those, like, what's the New York Times, like, there was Wordle, and what's the new one that everyone's doing?
I mean, I've been on the Vulture Cinematrix one since it started. Yeah. Like, when I get 9 out of 9, my God.
I can't do those because it becomes my entire day, and I will have psychological distress if I can't finish it. So I think this is why it's actually quite difficult for me to talk about these characters neutrally, because I see myself a lot.
I see
in
myself.
Robert Graysmith.
I see myself in all of them. I don't think it's a good thing.
It's not a good thing.
I see myself a little bit in Paul Avery, in the sense that I do see myself like peacocking around an office, typing away, wearing waistcoats, and then eventually succumbing to alcoholism and moving into a boat.
Yes, and I see myself in Robert, because what I find so interesting is that they both kind of move on. Mm-hmm. Because they have jobs that are related to this, and they go, it's been 4 years, he hasn't killed, we all gotta move on. Mm-hmm. And Robert Graysmith says,
nope.
No. Nope. Because once I start a puzzle, it becomes my life, and I need to finish the puzzle. Otherwise, my brain will not stop thinking about it. And I think that, I think that's his primary psychological motivator. And I think links very strongly to the wider, like, cultural interest in true crime, is that once your brain latches onto a question, it can be really difficult to let go of it. Because I think it's sort of, I guess I'm sort of repeating myself, it's that distress. Like, the brain becomes distressed, and it seems, I think it seems really messed up that for him it becomes completely detached from the victims and from the actual reality that these are serial murders. But I get it. I do get it.
I get
there's
it.
Something very human about it.
I think it is a very human film, especially thinking about the other Fincher serial killer media, all of which I either have or will be covering on the series, because out of the English language American movie makers, he's probably been the most influential, from Seven through to Zodiac and then into Mindhunter. He has essentially, at least visually and tonally, defined how American film and TV making approaches this genre, and, you know, the serial killer and the detective that's obsessed with them as a figure. How do you think he does it here? How does this sit between Seven and Mindhunter in the Fincher catalog of filmic obsessions?
Well, I was gonna say, Jonathan Groff's character, is it Holden?
It is Holden, character? Yes.
Yeah, because I always think Holden Caulfield. He's a bit of a Holden. Like, I feel like Holden is a bit like Robert Graysmith. I think he's very good at creating these characters who are quite likable, quite sweet. But then you go, well, it's a bit ethically weird that you're so... I had a theory that Holden was the murderer for a long time, because I was like, he's into this in quite a weird way. But I understand now that he just wanted to solve the puzzle, and I get that.
If Holden was going to be the murderer, then, I mean, I'm definitely on some sort of list, because all I've been doing for the past several months is talking about serial killer movies.
Yes, but if you were on a Netflix show, people would definitely think you were the person for a long time.
I promise. I promise.
I think he's very good, and I haven't seen Seven in a long time, I'm going to be honest. I don't really remember how the detective characters act in that. But they all kind of share that same idea that think he's good at getting into the kind of person who becomes obsessed, because I think a lot of detective stories, what I find quite boring about them is that it's always they're an alcoholic and they've got nothing left, and this is our one big case to prove themselves, and that's how they get wrapped up in it out of sort of like a desperation for something. While I don't think that's true, I think you have to be of a specific psychological profile, and that is I want to say that when I'm talking about Robert Graysmith, I'm not talking about the real person. I don't know him. My only
We're talking about the character
connection is the character. I don't want to make any allegations about that real person, but the guy in the movie, like, he is the prime personality to be a detective, even though he's not, because he has this sort of like a frenzy, and I think that's the Jake Gyllenhaal factor, right? Is those eyes start to pop out of his head, and you're like, oh, he's got an idea. Like, there's a hysteric aspect to it, and I think that's what I relate to, is that there is when you get fixed into a thought pattern or a thought cycle, and this might be more about my brain, I get kind of hysterical, and I would go to the library and check out every single code book and read all the code books and then bring the code books to Mark Ruffalo and go, look. I
so intensely empathize with that, because I can even describe the physical feeling of it, and I think Gyllenhaal portrays it in his performance, where there's a wonderful scene where he's having dinner with his family, his wife, Clarisse, who pops up for a few minutes, and his kids, and there's a news item about the Zodiac, and you can just see that he's like, he's saying some words, yes, honey, but he's completely locked into the one thing that's interesting to him. And he, like, his entire body is tensed up as soon as something about this case comes up. And I know this feeling of, like, this almost hysterical amount of energy that courses through you when you're locked into something and you just have to get it done, whatever that might be. And I remember when I was writing my first book, I had that feeling. I was like locking myself into my apartment and be like, I have to just sit here and finish it. I cannot read anymore. I cannot see the words that are coming out on the page. I just have to get to the point where I can type the full stop and I can close it and it is done. And then there's a whole nother bit of work that comes after it, but that doesn't matter because the main thing is to finish it. And you're kind of just like powering through on sheer adrenaline to get through it. And you make bad choices like Graysmith does in this film, where he just gets into cars with strangers and goes to random fucking basements in dark areas of San Francisco. And I get that obsession, and I do think there's no one better than Gyllenhaal to play that particular frenzied state of, I'm locked in, I need to get this done. I'm not a bad person, but everyone needs to get out of my way right now, because the only thing that I can focus on, that I can do, is to keep going to solve this mystery.
Yeah, which I guess is why you do get a lot when detectives are very well written, they do then tend to be interpreted as neurodivergent in some way, because I think that's a part of it. Is kind of how the neurodivergent brain operates, is in cycles and patterns and locking into things. And so I think, probably why I find Robert Graysmith so relatable is that it's that idea, like, the brain just locks in. Like, this is, and I feel like that's why I understand why he seems kind of not particularly empathetic towards the victims, because he's like fully locked in and he like can't even help himself. And that's why I sort of love the scenes with Chloe Sevigny, is I feel like she sort of gets it as well. Is that she's recognized something in her husband of like, oh my gosh, this is not about me, you can't control this. And it's a sort of nicer way to portray the detective's wife. Again, I know he's not a detective. Usually they're, pointing their finger and yelling and going, you've made me an alcoholic. I'm leaving you.
Well, and she does leave him, but she leaves him temporarily.
In a nice way.
Yeah.
And then
she's
she
like,
has
just
that,
get it done.
She comes back and she says, dude, have you eaten? Like, are you okay? The kids really miss you. Babe, I know you have to do this because this is how you are. But I'm just checking, are you okay, buddy? I love that relationship. And I know there's this thing of like, the female character's always sort of getting sidelined because it's always wife. But I think for a character that does not have a huge amount of screen time, I really like how she was portrayed.
Always in good hands with Chloe Sevigny.
True.
And I mean, I think this is the main thing that everybody talks about when we talk about Zodiac, right? Is about how it's a portrait of obsession. It's not really a portrait of a serial killer. And, Fincher is notoriously a very exacting and obsessive director, and across all of his films, and he very much with this one, with Zodiac, because he grew up at the time when Zodiac was in operation and sort of roughly in the area where he was murdering. From what I've read, and it's not been kind of particularly extensive from interviews that I've read with him, he did sort of go with his producer and the screenwriter, going above and beyond, talking to everyone who was still living, who was involved with the case, families of the victims, the police officers' wives. Obviously Graysmith was involved, but I wonder, what do you think about how it portrays obsession filmically? Not necessarily just through the characters, but through the filmmaking itself.
Well, the two things that I know is that for the scene, the lakeside murder, he was like, oh, there were trees there when this originally happened and the trees had gone. So he brought trees in with just enough water for them to survive the shoot. And then, I don't know, I guess the trees died, which is kind of sad. Because he wanted to have it look exactly like it did the day that crime happened. And it was the same thing with the taxi driver who was shot and killed on the corner. He wanted to shoot on that corner. The residents were like, absolutely not. Do not bring those vibes here, please. So he said, okay, I'm just going to recreate it in CGI. So it, like, that corner looks exactly like the real place that it happened, even though they were unable to shoot there. And I feel like for me, I mean, going beyond sort of that's just what David Fincher's like as a filmmaker. He is like very fixated on detail. For the effect for the viewer, I guess, is it has to be as close to reality as possible, because otherwise we can't be drawn in the same way. I think his aim with this movie is to make us Robert Graysmith. Like, he wants us to be as obsessed with it and as frustrated and driven to hysteria by the end as the characters. Because I guess otherwise the movie is not effective for him. And I do think it works, because that final scene is enraging and scary and upsetting.
We'll get to it. But I completely agree with... I've watched this movie many times. When I was looking at it this time round and so close to Memories of Murder, there was something so tiresome about the amount of information, all the paper, all the dates, all the kind of the shifting nature of 1 week later, 2 months later, 4 years later, 10 years later,
Or it's even like 9 hours later. It's
yes,
like, probably didn't need that. But okay.
Exactly. Like, it's the exacting, because there is so much paperwork. There's so much investigation. There's so many reports. There's so many details. There's so much media coverage. Then there's pop culture interpretations of it as well. There's so much stuff, and so many voices involved. Victims, witnesses, survivors, names that... And because it's these three different professions, the amateur sleuth, the actual detective, his partner, Bill, who then kind of goes away mid-film, and Avery, the journalist, and all of the editorial staff of the San Francisco Chronicle, you know, you're also in the middle of all of these institutions that don't really collaborate with one another. And then within the police force, you're also between like state lines and the different police and sheriff departments of different counties and whatnot. So there's so much bureaucracy that it can, for people who are not fans of this film, it can get deadening, because you're like, why am I shifting through so many phone calls to deal with like a fax or a memo or a file or whatever? But then you're like, that is the nature of the obsession, right? Is that you will shift through this mountain of paperwork to get to the one little line that might contain something that will break something open.
And so many dead ends in this. I feel like even so much more than Memories of Murder. Everything seems like it's a clue. Where they go in the train and there's like the little squirrels everywhere, and it's like, they did it. It's like everything seems like it's like, oh, the squirrels did it. They're somehow involved, because why would they be there? That's such an odd thing. It has to be a relevant detail, and it's not at all relevant. They're just there.
I know. That's one thing that is left unexplained, is like, why does Lee Allen have like so many fucking squirrels, including squirrels in his freezer? My god.
Because I guess that's the idea, though. It's like, even if we take the idea that he was the Zodiac killer, not every detail of his life was relevant to the murders. You know, he did all this, also loved or had an interest in squirrels.
Well, one thing that I love that Fincher did very deliberately is that he just visually made the figure of the Zodiac unreliable. The actors that he cast to appear as the Zodiac were different heights, different builds, different weights. So even you as the viewer, you couldn't really say, oh, it's this guy, it's definitely Lee Allen, because he has the same kind of height or the same build. Because then in another scene where we see the Zodiac murder someone, it looks to be, you know, shorter or bigger or has a different voice. And I was wondering kind of, what do you think about the way, because contrary to Memories of Murder, we do get to see the Zodiac in action. He constantly is communicating, both via phone and letter. How is he portrayed? How is the actual serial killer portrayed?
I think it's so smart to have done this, inconsistent actors. Because I have watched so many movies where I've guessed who it was, because, you know, you see like a bit of hand.
Yeah.
And because I watch too many movies, I go, oh, that's that actor's hands.
Totally.
You go, it's him. It's him, because that's what the back of his head looks like.
Yeah.
Movie ruined. So on a very practical level, I think you sort of have to make that choice to for this film to actually be convincing about the unsolvable nature of it. And I guess beyond that, it's, he does sort of get into the tension of this real killer. It's both I think there's a line very similar to Memories of Murder about when they're describing who the guy is, and it's just like, it's just any old white guy. Could be any, like, his face was round, I guess. Like, there's something very generic about him, yet contrasted with this highly specific aesthetic that he built for himself, with not only the codes but this like costume that we see, the black hood and the little symbol, and they keep trying to figure out what the symbol has to have some meaning, and they think it's from a watch ad, and then they think it's from the, like, a film reel, the first thing that you cut off. And it's, there's, I don't know, there's something like weird and unsettling about that, about the fact that he presents himself as this, you know, almost supernatural being, because all the codes feel very ancient, like it's like a mythological thing. But then, you know, in reality, that the guy underneath there was the most ordinary looking guy that you see, like 30 of them every day when you walk out to the street, like middle-aged white guy. Something within it, and I think the film captures that very well.
Yeah, it's this it's like we were talking about earlier at the start, is the desire to make it mythical being then confronted with a very, very pedestrian reality. It's almost disappointing, you know?
Yeah, which is, to shout out a podcast that we've done together. Obviously, the Zodiac Killer has appeared multiple times in American Horror Story.
Shout out to the next Supremes. They will be back.
I love that show, but that show so much leans into the idea that these are like mythological people because they become so defined by the iconography, and the Zodiac Killer is so defined by that outfit that I guess we only know that he wore once, right? Because it was only at that one beachside murder that there seems to be any documented case of him appearing in this like supervillain costume. I do find that part maybe the most weird. I don't know, it's the most upsetting, weird, but sort of like interesting part of the case is why did he make himself like a little outfit to do it? Like it's horrifying. And I think it's because he wanted, like, as much as I love American Horror Story, he wanted that to happen. He wanted to become like a pop culture thing.
Yeah.
The
way that all of the detective figures try to figure out the meaning behind the choices, the meaning behind the symbol, behind the outfit, is again part of that trying to understand the reasoning. They never do, because there's even so many different quote unquote explanations for the name and the symbol of the Zodiac. Oh, it's the thing that pops up on the film reels. Oh, it's the advert of the watch. They're trying to find connections, and again, they end up being dead ends, or they end up being so many different explanations. But what I find really curious is that in the middle, and this, obviously, the Zodiac was never captured, so that investigation is technically still open in some jurisdictions. It's the fact that the pop culture element comes into the film about him. Toschi, we mentioned before, actively in the film, they say that the way that he wears his gun inspired Steve McQueen in Bullet. All of these characters go to see Dirty Harry in the cinema, where there's the Scorpio killer who's inspired by the Zodiac Killer that they're still actively chasing. Like, there's almost this thing of, oh, the movies have caught up with you and you still haven't solved it. So now by he I mean the Zodiac, is getting this fame, this notoriety, the legend that's being written by screenwriters, and he can continue doing it, and we still don't know the real reason why. It's like the most realistic and also the most frustrating version of a serial killer movie, because we do not get to understand.
And then you ask, well, if it wasn't Alan, and because they say in the movie some people think he's still alive, did he go see Zodiac? And what does even David Fincher's movie feed into what he ultimately wanted?
Totally.
And are we letting him win? Like, it's, yeah. That's the big question, isn't it? Because, like, whenever you make a piece of media about a serial killer, so many of them wanted that to happen. And yet at the same time, like, can we resist the impulse? Because there is just a desire to tell these stories.
And do you think that, we've spoken a lot about Graysmith already as a character, not the real man. We don't know him. Live and be. Do you think that the change of pace in the second part of the film to focusing almost exclusively on Graysmith and his pursuit of the Zodiac, does that change the tone of the film for you?
I guess I like the second half more because I don't often relate to detective characters, and I'm like, oh, now I'm the main character of the story. I love it. And my favorite scene that I find I think it's a lot of people's favorite scene is when he goes to the basement.
Yes.
because that's the moment of, oh, I was so hyperfixated on this thing. I've actively put myself in danger because I lost all outside awareness. Which in itself, I think, is just a... Obviously, I've never been there with that situation. But I feel like people can relate, people who have like a hyperfixating kind of mentality can relate to the, oh, I went too deep. And now I put myself in trouble.
We should talk about the ending. Because that's another example of that, right? It's another example of him putting himself potentially in harm's risk by insisting to go and see Lee Allen, the kind of the number one suspect, which the film very heavily leans towards him as being the real Zodiac killer. What do you think of that scene, of that confrontation when Gyllenhaal, Graysmith, goes to the store where he works now and just stares him down?
I see it the same as the ending of Memories of Murder. The moment of acceptance of, I'm going to be insane for the rest of my life because I'm pretty sure it's this guy. And the way that he's looking at me, I kind of feel like he knows that I know. Or wait, that he know. You get what
I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
But you can't, that's the thing. I feel like, just within the context of the movie, he's certain it's him.
Yes.
But never having the closure that's the painful thing. Because we can believe, there's a difference between belief and concrete fact. And the inability to transition from one to the other, I think that's the source of insanity, right? Because you can't just will it. You can't just will it into being. And he's done everything that he could, and he's gotten as much evidence as he physically can. And he's hit the wall of going, there's nothing I can do anymore. And I've lost the control. Because I think this is the thing about investigation, is that you have a level of control over the situation, right? Mm-hmm. And that's pleasurable, it's comforting, it's nice. And I think it can make you feel like you're working towards justice, because you're like, right, it's in my hands now. I can change the world for the better. And that moment you have to just let go is, it's the worst feeling in the world.
Well, I think of it slightly differently, again, in relation to Memories of Murder, because Memories of Murder is, he's not looking in the face of the killer, he's looking at our faces. And I think at this scene, Graysmith has so convinced himself that Alan is the Zodiac that he just needs that extra little thing to look him straight in the eyes to convince himself that, yes, this is the one. And that, I think, relates to the kind of the way that the detectives in Memories of Murder convince themselves that they've got the right suspect, and then actual evidence and fact proves them differently. But Graysmith never gets that. He's fully given himself away to the obsession, like you're saying. And I think this is the final thing, even though it's completely nonsensical. I think he's proving to himself that he's right by looking this man in the eyes.
Right.
And for himself, with no kind of harsh evidence in that moment, deciding that, yes, he is right, that Arthur Lee Allen is the Zodiac. And I think that this is where the film leans most heavily into that theory, because Fincher shows us kind of some suspects. Rick Marshall is mentioned at one point. There's a kind of another strong suspect. He's kind of heavily implies that the guy who used to work at the movie theater is a suspect. But in that scene, and Arthur Lee Allen, we should say, is played by John Carroll Lynch, fabulous character actor, long-term American Horror Story ensemble cast member as well. He's great. And in that scene, he's directed to have this, his face sort of transforms. It goes dark. He goes, as the people online say, he gives you the dead eyes. So I think the film itself is telling us, yeah, it's this guy.
Oh.
Do you see it? Do you see it in in John Carroll Lynch's performance?
What I see is that he has a moment, there's an awareness on his face. But I don't think, to me, conclusively means anything, because I think I could also interpret his expression as, oh, I know that you think, oh, you've come because you think I'm the guy. It's true. Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe I'm wrong.
I don't think either one of us is wrong.
Yeah, I always interpret it as being like, it kind of feels like he is, but gosh, you can't. He could be, that expression could be something else.
It's really interesting. And, let's talk about the ending across both of these films, They both end with, shockingly similar framings. There are kind of epilogues to Zodiac as well, where we see Mike Mageau, now kind of an adult, point out Arthur Lee Allen on the page, kind of identifying him as the Zodiac, and there's a series of, after biographical details about all the people involved. But do you find that the endings of both Memories of Murder and Zodiac, do they leave you unsatisfied? Or do you think that they work because they're so aggressively inconclusive?
Second one. Because, I mean, they make me feel awful. Because it's horrible to, I don't know, maybe not knowing things is, to me, just such an ugly feeling, and I hate it.
Dislike it
because
immensely.
It speaks to a lack of control over your settings and your surroundings, even though these are two things that have no effect on my life whatsoever. And the thing with Zodiac is that you are right, it does point towards Alan being most likely, but I think the film itself is a different kind of frustrating, because it's about the fact that they will never be able to prove that in court. It will never become fact. Yeah. I think Memories of Murder is more about it could be anyone. Mm-hmm. Some things are so beyond your grasp, this is just never going to be solved. I mean, obviously it was solved, but at the time it felt like they were just never going to solve it. No idea. Mm-hmm. And Zodiac is about a different kind of uncertainty, that you can even get to the point where you have the evidence. You can have one of the victims pointing to a photograph and saying, yeah, this is the guy. Mm-hmm. But then he died. And so
you never know.
Now that's never gonna, you say that the case is still open, but unless there's some miraculous DNA discovery, no one's ever gonna know for the rest of time. And there are certain mysteries that are just never going to be solved, and we hate it as a society because people are still trying to solve the Zodiac killer. People are still trying to decipher the code, and it's like, just leave it.
And
man.
we hate it as audiences as well, because we want to know the ending to our story. We want to know who it is. We want to know who killed who. We want to see characters move on. And I wonder as well, kind of, because both of these films are based on real life murders, real life serial killers, one of which was captured, one of whom was not. How do both these films treat the truth?
As concrete, but unattainable. Or extremely elusive. Mm. Which is the tricky thing with justice, right? And the court system, is that it's not the same as the truth. And there's a difference between, it is a fact that somebody killed those people. Mm-hmm. But we have to have had, we as a society had to set up a system to make that fact a fact.
No,
Does
I
that
get it.
make
No, I
sense?
get it. I totally get it.
And that's like that's the real messed up, complicated part of all of this, is that there is a reality and there is a person who did it, but it's so difficult for us to reach that point because, you know, we have so many cases of where it seems the person is convicted of the crime and then boom, evidence appears years later. Oh, okay, that was not the reality that we thought was the reality. And it's the question of, okay, is there ever a way to get to that truth where you can be 100% certain? It's because sometimes people confess and then they actually didn't do it. So it's so messed up and I hate thinking about it.
Well, in the case of Memories of Murder, you know, there was even a guy who, you know, they got a false confession out of, and he was in prison for 20 years before he was eventually acquitted because he had been tortured into a confession. The reason I wanted to ask that question is because I think both Memories of Murder and Zodiac have very different pretensions, in the sense that Memories of Murder is a story that is inspired by a real life series of murders, but it is not trying to be accurate to that particular case. It's very impressionistic. It's creating characters that are composites. You know, there was not just 3 detectives working on this case. Apparently there was up to 2 million officers working on these murders at that time. So it is so much more concerned with being a film with a story and a theme and a tone and a particular thing that it wants to say. But Zodiac, partly I think because it's Fincher, partly because a sense of, you know, maybe ownership over the story because of where he was from, because of the era in which these murders were happening, because of the unsolved mystery, you know, the hubristic approach to, I want to do the definitive take on this particular serial killer that's become embedded in American pop culture. I think there's this intent to be the most accurate that I think sort of, and I love this film, I've said this many times, I'm not saying this is a negative, but I think it sets us up as an audience for a certain expectation of truthfulness that is perhaps deceiving, because this is not the truth. This is a movie with a script and actors playing fictionalized versions of real people that is inspired by a real case, but this is not detective work that we're seeing on screen.
Or is it? Do you think David Fincher thought he was going to solve it? Because I kind of do.
I think you might have, which is also why I hope he never listens to this episode.
But I would as well. I don't say that as a negative. I mean,
yeah,
the intensity of research that he did makes me think he must, because I feel like that's the most human thing to happen, is that you become obsessed with it yourself. And maybe there was a part of him that thought, if I just, you know, it's like doing the big wall of pins. It's sort of the cinematic version of that. Oh gosh, maybe if I lay everything out, the answer will appear, and it didn't, and that's why we have the ending that we have. Is to reflect maybe Fincher's own frustrations that, oh, there's no getting to the bottom of this.
Considering that these are murder mysteries without a solution, what do you think they require from us, from the audience, that maybe other serial killer movies don't?
Don't be annoying and rate this 1 star on Letterboxd because you didn't like the ending. I don't know. I think it requires a level of humility from the audience, because I do get very frustrated by, and this is me being judgy, I get very frustrated by people who don't like open endings. Because that's life, and this is what these films speak to, is that we don't get answers to everything. And I actually love those kinds of endings because there is something incredibly emotive about them, because it's just like speaking a sentence and you just don't quite get to the end. It's like held breath. And I feel like if people the only thing that these movies ask of us is to have humility about it and just be open and just accept that's... Well, don't accept, because I think part of it is the frustration. But just, just don't rate it 1 star on Letterboxd because you didn't like that.
I think it's very beautiful, but I'm gonna be real petulant and be like, no, I want that ending. I don't get enough closure in my real life. I don't go to the movies for real life. I go to the movies for a story.
True, but I kind of go to the movies to feel insane, because then I'm feeling insane about something. Because this is the thing. This is what's great. I'm feeling insane about the Zodiac Killer. That ultimately is not about me. And I can, at the end of the day, go, well, you've had your 25 minutes of feeling insane about the Zodiac Killer. And that 25 minutes, you were not feeling insane about your own life.
You know what? As much as I was trying to crack a joke, I think you've kind of hit the nail and articulated why I personally, me as a person, go to the Zodiac for comfort. Is because I think I've always struggled with the idea of closure, and if very often, more often than not, you don't get closure for things that are very big in your life or very important or very hurtful. And I know that, all the therapists on TikTok will say that closure doesn't exist. And it took me a long while to understand that. And I think Zodiac kind of as a film reminds me of that no amount of research, no amount of detective work will necessarily create closure out of nothing. The only person who can give that to yourself is yourself. And you can move on if you choose to. And otherwise you become Robert Graysmith.
So what you're saying is David Fincher is your therapist.
Listen, he's been my therapist since I was a teenager.
That's beautiful.
It's beautiful, man.
That.
And before I wrap up, I remember thinking when I first watched Memories of Murder in the cinema, which I'm so grateful for that I got to watch it for the first time in the cinema, as did you. I remember turning around to my boyfriend and being like, well, I think David Fincher owes Bong Joon-ho an explanation. Do you think there would even be a Zodiac without Memories of Murder?
Oh. I think yes. Because I guess 7 exists, and I think it was always in David Fincher's DNA. And I think the structure of Zodiac is the way you tell that story correctly and logically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it had to be that way, because otherwise he would not be doing justice to the reality. I do think, however, watching them back to back, and I love Zodiac. I've given both of these 5 stars on Letterboxd. I went back to check. You do go, oh, Bong Joon-ho is working at a different level.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
He's just on a completely different... Because I do think, everything about Zodiac is so... And I do think it's very complex and very, very self-critical. Mm-hmm. And yet you do get, but they're quite... There is a little bit of that Hollywood, glamour to all these 3 leads that, is contrasted so sharply with the detectives in Memories of Murder, which feel more realistic, I will say, to a sense. And I feel like the deconstruction in Bong Joon-ho's movies it's just so much more dramatic than Zodiac. And I feel like you only really appreciate that when you watch them back to back.
Yes. I would genuinely recommend to listeners to watch these 2 films back to back. I watched, for the purposes of this episode, watched Zodiac first and then I watched Memories of Murder.
I did the other way around.
Yeah.
Which made it worse because I was watching Zodiac going, oh, okay.
I think I wanted to save myself from that because I had seen Memories of Murder more recently than I had rewatched Zodiac, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna look out for the things that I remember from Memories, and then I'm gonna watch it and be like, oh, I see what you did there.
We still love you, David Fincher.
I love you very much.
You can't be Bong Joon-ho. No one can.
No one can. And before we wrap up, is there anything that you wanted to mention about either Memories of Murder or Zodiac that maybe we haven't discussed?
I liked the irony that the kids are watching Scooby-Doo on the television in Zodiac.
It's basically Scooby-Doo.
I do think if you're talking about the cultural history of serial killers, Scooby-Doo does have a role to play, because they always solved it. And it was always like, that show exists in a world of such certainty, except for that one movie that traumatized me, where they go to the werewolf cat island, and they try to unmask the werewolf cats, and they can't because they're real. And I watched it on Halloween one night, and I ate so much candy, and I was so scared, because I was like, maybe monsters are real. Scooby-Doo told me that they weren't, and then it undid that, and it was literally like, it was as big a rug pull as the endings of these movies. So I do think that Scooby-Doo is extremely relevant to this conversation, which is why I flagged it so much when I could hear it in the background of that one scene that Jake Gyllenhaal's kids are watching TV.
Oh my god, I love this. I love this so much. I've so missed having 2-hour-long conversations about movies with you, Clarisse.
Me too.
I'm speechless.
No one else puts up with my insane comments like you do, and so I really appreciate that.
Oh, it's genius. Oh, it's so genius. That's just such a beautiful ending, man. You've just upended the endings of both Zodiac and Memories of Murder. Thank you.
Really,
so
it's a triple bill.
It really is.
Zodiac, Memories of Murder, that I don't even remember the name. The one where they go to the werewolf cat island.
Before I let you go, on that note of just pure Loughrey brilliance, where can people find more of your work online?
On Twitter, at Clarisse Lou, or Clarisse Loughrey. Everything's on there. Or I guess if you go on The Independent, when you just Google my name, The Independent, and my reviews will come up.
And also your podcast, Fade to Black, which comes out every week.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Sorry, I always forget to do that.
It's
yes.
okay.
And there's more of that. I probably talk about Scooby-Doo quite a lot.